You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
Before, yeah. Do you know the rule? How much money you get when you pass go? Anybody? You can yell it out. Yeah, $200. All right. Does anybody know what you have to do to get out of jail? Roll a double. There we go. We got it. Does anyone know how much money each person has to start with? No? Not like the specific denominations where you have to count it out and make sure everybody... So it's one of those things that inevitably you have to go back to the instructions to figure out how to set up the game, right? And I found as I was thinking about the story of creation that in Genesis 1 we find a very similar way that story is written down. It doesn't just kind of fall out of the sky for us, but instead it is written in a context where the people are leaving Babylon from exile. And having had all of these different creation stories, both part of other cultures and within their own, they needed a way to remember what matters most as we head back home. What stories are we going to tell that will influence our children? Questions that maybe after the torture and pain of the past several generations as they were slaves in Babylon might prompt them to ask, does any of this really matter? Does God really care about us at all? What sort of God would allow us to go that way? And now if God is on our side, what must we do to secure a future? All of these questions prompted the people to begin collecting the stories that had sustained them into a sacred text. And so over the next few centuries, stories that had been shared over campfire or written in prophetic speeches or historic annals began to be compiled. And that is how the Hebrew Scriptures were formed. And so over the next several weeks, I want us to read through some of these passages from the book of Genesis, revisiting these early narratives with the idea that having become familiar with naming ourselves as exiles from the wealth and power and elite of today, as we read in 1 Peter over the past few weeks, that now if we are indeed exiles, searching for a way in the margins with those who also suffer, how might we begin to see the world, better ways to frame our present and our future? And so I'd like to read some selections from Genesis chapter 1 and into chapter 2. This is the first of two creation accounts that we find in Genesis. Genesis 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 says, "When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day." Skipping over some days, now we find ourselves toward the end. Genesis chapter 1, verse 24 through chapter 2, verse 4. "Then God said, 'Let us make humans in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and of the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth.' So God created humans in His image. In the image of God He created them. Male and female He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth.' God said, 'See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And every beast of the earth, and every bird of the air, and everything that creeps of the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food.' And it was so. God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all of their multitude. On the sixth day, God finished the work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all the work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that He had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." Now, if you were to keep reading past verse 4 of chapter 2, you would find a very different story of creation. For this one, the remainder of chapter 2, we find that man is created first, and then all of the animals, and then toward the end of that, woman. This is also where we find the setup for the tree of life that has the fruit that they can't eat, and then all of the stuff that happens there. That story, unlike this one in chapter 1, reads a lot like a fable or a fairy tale, something that you could really easily see being told over a campfire night after night. Our text, however, is much more ordered, less on narrative flourish, and reads instead like poetry with repeating phrases and ideas. In fact, if I would have gone through all of it, you would be able to repeat those phrases back to me, where I would say things like, it was evening and then it was morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. We could say things like, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And of course, at the end of every day, and God said, it was good. And this kind of repetitive poetry is meant to counteract the repetitive stories that the people of God had heard. Often our lives are filled with prevailing narratives and counter-narratives. And I think this first story that we find in Genesis of creation is a counter-narrative, a way to challenge how these exiles thought about the world around them. The Babylonians had a creation account. Most ancient civilizations did. And in all of these stories, they did not seek to explain how the world came to be, but instead why it was the way it was. And so in Babylon, the people of God would hear stories about how also the world opens in chaos. Here, primordial entities of Apsu and Tiamat ruled over the disorder, and they created other beings who were also at war with one another. Eventually, winds would blow across all of this soup of chaos, where eventually the gods would unite against Ea and Ea's champion Marduk. And as these chaotic winds would blow, Marduk eventually went to battle with Tiamat, splitting her in two and creating the earth and the sky. And as the story goes on, humans would be created out of the blood of the gods that would also be killed. And humans would become subject and slaves to the whims of the gods, eventually even slaves to the divine who would create Babylon as a city and the temple of Marduk in its center. And so imagine how hearing that the world began in bloodshed among family members, of chaos and enslavement, born out of the anger and the jealousy of the gods. It would explain so much. Corrupt governments? Well, that makes sense. Yeah, sure. War where innocents die while the powerful are safe? Yeah, that reads okay. Famine and cancer and floods and sibling rivalries and people who don't know how to zipper merge onto a highway? All of that makes sense when we see that the world began with such chaos and violence. But when we begin reading Israel's story of creation, we might hear a counter-narrative to what they had grown up with. Sure enough, there is chaos and darkness over the face of the deep, over the domains of the gods like Tiamat. But the winds of God, the breath of God that blows, is not to kill, but to create. Not by blood, but by words. Like, let there be light. Not even a command from God, but more of an invitation. And then God saw that the light was good. And so in this story, what we find is that God begins in 3 days of separating, of making room, of separating light from dark, separating sky from water, and then earth from sea. And after those 3 days of stretching creation out so there is room, God begins to fill that creation in all of those spaces. First, stars in the sky that was created, and then the sun to light our day, creatures to swim and to fly, and then filling the land on the final day of creation, not only with the creeping things and the animals, but also us. And each day, we are told that God was pleased with how the invitation was received. Some people will read this story and find humans given such an important place in the grand scheme of things and decide that we should pillage the land for its resources, build wealth, and if the climate suffers, it must be God's will. Some will read it and find it silly that ancient people didn't consider the universe-spanning scale of billions of years, 6 days, as a joke. They must be dummies, and dismiss the whole story as nonsense. Some will say that it was not divine love that made the world, but instead random chance, and any grasp at meaning is just us trying to make up stories to help us sleep at night. And I guess that, like the Babylonian story, each of the ways we imagine how the world was started is probably right. Each of the meanings that we place upon all of the narratives that we have come to hear, we probably are correct in reading the world that way. Each origin story shapes how we live in the present, how we might imagine the future. And so it's important for us to see how our scriptures have sought to inform us, not as a way of explaining away the Big Bang or saying, yeah, dinosaurs and humans walked around together, or any of that, but instead of maybe imagining that rather than the world being simply random, or even worse, violent and evil, that we might say underneath all that we know, God said it was good. In the story presented in Genesis, we find God bringing order to chaos. Again, not through the force of God's will, but instead through an invitation given to the chaos. Let there be. It's a partnership with creation. That God invites creation to play along, to build with God. It's not a detachment from creation where God just sets the thing spinning and then walks off to another room, nor is it an iron-fisted rule where everything is meted out by how God works. Instead, what we find is God makes room and then fills it with vibrant and diverse life, and makes more room and does the same. And so I want us to read this passage and consider that being one of the very ways that God is in the world, making space for something new, and then giving it room to take root and find new life. Maybe over millennia and eons and centuries and billions of years of making room and giving new life. So after the exile, Israel runs into and finds itself in the middle of all of these world powers. They knew what it was like to be under the thumb of Egypt and escaping in the Exodus and finding themselves in the promised land. And then they encounter Assyria and Babylon, and after that, Persia and the Greeks. And each of these world powers found their center of worship in their capital city, an amassing of power not of just military might, but of religious and spiritual significance. But Jerusalem was destroyed. And that does something to your theology, not just your military capabilities or your financial security, but your theology. The temple, too, with it, completely destroyed when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem and took the people off in chains. As far as they could tell, their God was toppled. And so now that we're going back, is that God going to be there waiting for us? How are we to navigate ourselves in a land where all these other gods, like Marduk, seemingly could defeat the God of Yahweh? They had walked the streets of Babylon and seen statues of Marduk everywhere they looked, depictions of its gods, images cast in stone and set in its temple. They knew who was the most powerful. And so where could their God be in the midst of all of that? We often run into the same questions. Not that we see different statues of different gods around, but it can often be that as we look around, we find we feel powerless. That even our faith feels insufficient to face whatever we have to face today or tomorrow. And so I find it intriguing in a reading of Genesis 1 that some scholars see it in its ordered and measured way of presenting how God would go about building, that it's like the building of a temple, just like the ones that they would have in Athens or Babylon or Nineveh. Only here, instead of locating the temple in a city or even a nation, God's temple is all of creation. And the final act of any good temple project is to place the image of that God in the middle of the temple, so that wherever people would look and they see that image, they would know, oh, this is who this belongs to. Only God decided to put God's image not cast in stone, but instead flesh and blood. And not just in one place, but in every place. So that no matter where we go, we are reminded, well, there's an image of God. Oh, and there's an image of God. And these images don't look the same, and speak the same, and love the same, and even worship the same, and yet there they are. What might that tell us? That it's not a God of the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Egyptians that we worship, but a God of all peoples, of all creation, of all places, of all everything. And that this God, who's made a temple of all of the cosmos, of all that is seen and unseen in the world, has named that creation as good, including you. So good, in fact, that God's like, I need a day off. A day of rest from that work, and then gifts that day to us as well. It's not just a day for the master to rest while the slaves of humanity go about the work, but instead God invites God's creation to also rest. This is one of those stories that it includes oh, that's why we practice Sabbath. Okay, I get it now. It's a gift for us to enjoy with God. So, my girls have moved out of the house, and when they do come home, I love it. Not even if we're doing anything special, but just having them there, this idea of shared presence. They're just in the room, hanging out, or we're watching TV, or they're on their phone, and we're on our phones, whatever. But just the idea that they're present, and we're just kind of chilling, is meaningful for me. Enjoying life even in its ordinariness. It's another way that God creates space for us. These moments of rest where we can just relax and enjoy one another's company, where God invites us to enjoy God's company too. We, who are here at least, have made it part of our practice maybe to include this as the way we come to experience God's presence, how we just relax and are reminded that God is a good and loving God and that we are part of that creation. But there are multiple ways for us to experience that. We don't have to wait just for one day a week. We can find moments of rest in all the choices we make. But I want to remind us that creation stories were told to explain why things are. Not how did stuff start in the scientific way, but they were written of explaining why is life the way it is right now. And like those returning from exile, insecure in their hope or unsure of their future, we often need reminding that underneath all of our fear, all of our grief, all of our doubt, all of the chaotic winds that blow and push us out into troubled waters of unknown depths, that the creative invitation of God invites us to see all that has been made as good and true and beautiful. And so my hope is that in knowing that, we would know God's presence with us and say that it is good. Amen.